Send it to the House.
Call Dr. Megan Woods.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it's my pleasure also to take a call on this Riccarton Bush Amendment Act at its second reading. And I do want to, as my colleague, the Honourable Nick King did, I want to acknowledge the local member, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, who has brought this legislation to this House. But I also want to acknowledge the Riccarton Bush trustees for their very hard work that they've put into this piece of legislation, who, along with the Christchurch City Council's Legal Services team, have done much work in preparing the bill that we're examining now. Riccarton Bush is an incredibly important part of Christchurch and its natural and its built history. So Riccarton Bush and Riccarton House that members have alluded to that stand on that land. It's been an incredibly important part of our city for some time, but I would like to suggest that it is even more important in Christchurch as it is recreated post-earthquake, that heritage has become something of a contentious issue in our city. And this is a very important part of our heritage. It's part of our natural history, and it's also part of our built history. And we're having the second reading of this legislation at a time when much of Christchurch's heritage buildings are going as being subjected to the Wreckers' Bull. And there are many people who are feeling a great sense of grief and a great deal of loss of heritage in our city. So anything that this House can do to protect heritage and to ensure that something of our past remains in Christchurch is something that members on this side certainly are pleased to support. I noted that Jerry Brownlee, in his speech in this reading of the bill, talked about Hagley Park and its role in dividing the Presbyterians and the Anglicans in settlement Christchurch. And I'd like to suggest that maybe some new parks are going to be needed between the current Anglican Church Synod and the people of Christchurch over their decision to bowl the Christchurch City Cathedral. That these are things that Christchurch people feel dearly, and their attachment to our history and our built environment are something that run very deep. As members and myself in the previous reading of this bill have noted, this is an incredibly important part of our history. It speaks to so many aspects of it, from, as I said, our natural history, through to very early Māori settlement history predating Ngāi Tahu, through to the colonisation of Christchurch and how it was that our city grew and where it grew and what the different strains of migration involved in that were. But one of the other there's a couple of other things I'd like to acknowledge in this call that I'm taking on this. I'd like to acknowledge the work that I've already acknowledged the work that the Trust Board have done in terms of preparing this legislation to bring to the House, but I'd also like to acknowledge the Trust and the members of that Trust that did come along to the Select Committee hearing in Christchurch, who it was probably somewhat of a surprise for members there to know that members of the Trust had gathered around listening to the first reading speeches on this piece of legislation. And it was an incredibly important occasion for them. And it was because they'd put so much work into this. They know that to preserve this incredibly important part of our history, that work was needed. And I think it was touching for all members of the committee to know that those members had watched the first reading and had taken it on board. It's also worth noting that members of that trust also did bring a book to gift to our parliamentary library, further outlining the history of this incredibly important part of Christchurch. And I'd like to acknowledge the members of the Trust who did them and thank them for their gift to our library. But one of the things that I'd especially like to commend in this legislation is the way in which the board was very involved in putting together this piece of work and the way in which the local people were consulted. I think the way in which this was worked through, this piece of legislation was worked through, and the way in which local communities were involved, and the way that it has been an absolutely contentious, no contention whatever with this piece of legislation shows us what happens when you actually do involve local people in decision making. When local people feel that they have a stake in what is important to them, be that their heritage building, their local school, or anything else that is important to their regional council. Well, that's right, the Honourable Ruth Dyson, whether or not they get to vote for their local regional councillors. So that is very important, that what you can see the difference, that what we see, the great anxiety in Christchurch about so many decisions that this government is making at the moment, but when such as in this bill, local people are consulted and it is done very well. We can see the very real difference that is made. So we do support the tidying up that is in this legislation. That people have talked about the various pieces of legislation that it tidies up. And I think an important point to note in this is that while there was some suggestion that there should be a repeal and a new piece of legislation, for many people it was incredibly important that there was the perseverance of the historical acts, because that was as much a history of Riccarton Bush and Riccarton House as the grounds and the flora and fauna itself. That the legislation was an incredibly important part of the story of how this part of our city had come to be such a protected part of our land. So we very much welcome this tidying up. And we welcome this particularly, and I made this point in my first reading speech, we welcome this particularly in light of the local government reforms that are currently going through this House. Who knows whether Riccarton Bush and Riccarton House would be deemed a core service under the new regime that we're going to be living under soon with the local government reforms that would come through. This Act gives this incredibly important historical site within our city protections, and it importantly gives the funding that it receives some protections even under those local government reforms, because there are many people, ourselves included, that sort of not quite sure what's going to fall under this this core funding, whether or not it's going to fall, outside of what the government opposite consider to be core. V8 supercar races, garden shows, but who knows when it would come to Riccarton Bush and Riccarton House. So we congratulate the local member, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, for bringing this bill to the House and sponsoring this local bill to the House, so that we can ensure that this incredibly important part of our heritage is preserved. And in fact, we'd welcome that Honourable member bringing more bills to this House that would look to preserve the heritage of Christchurch. We think that it's a great road for him to go down. We look forward to the Cathedral Bill. That's right, Ruth Dyson. We would welcome and indeed offer support if the Honourable Jerry Brownlee were to bring a bill to the House seeking to protect the Christchurch Cathedral, Cranmer Courts, and the list really could go on. Perhaps the Honourable Ruth Dyson and her call on this bill might suggest a few other bills that the Honourable Jerry Brownlee could bring to this House, because it will be a very long catalogue of heritage bills that we would like to see here. So, well done to everyone in bringing this legislation. It's important. It was important before the earthquakes in Christchurch, but it is even more important in post-earthquake Christchurch. I think that it shows us what can be achieved when we work with our local communities rather than imposing decisions on them, and that we involve local people in local decisions and we let their voices be heard. There are so many salient tales for us in this piece of legislation, and so many key learnings that we need to draw out of how this was done. Involve local people, have good and accurate information to make your decisions on, and respect your past. Labour is happy to commend this bill to the House.
I call Eugenie Sage.
I'm pleased to take a short call on the Riccarton Bush Amendment Bill, which, as other speakers have